about this expression. It sums it up quite nicely because of the importance of the chemical products across the value chains and the importance of also the prominent role of the European chemicals industry. So the question is how to decarbonize the chemical sector, given that it's an energy-intensive industry, and then you need to pay close attention to this transition, but also to keep it competitive in a volatile geopolitical and geoeconomic environment we find ourselves in, and in the absence of the level playing field, again, globally. So that's decarbonization and competitiveness together. Can we make that happen? Let's try to see if we can find some of the answers and also recognize and see and address some of the trade-offs to the extent possible. We'll start by presenting some of our recent findings and recommendations, and then I would be happy to hear from our distinguished panelists that we have pleasure to have today. And I'll just briefly introduce you. So we have Alexis van Maercke, Director General from A.I.S.E. We have Nicola Rega, Executive Director from Cefic, European Chemical Industry Council, and Florie Gonsolin, Program Lead, EU Industry Transformation, Agora Industry. Our lead author, Anna Crawford, was supposed to also to present the main findings, but unfortunately she couldn't make it. I was one of the co-authors, and also together with another colleague of ours, Anna Bejanishvili. So I will just briefly shed some key, let's say, highlights about our research. I mean, it's a relatively short, but I also hope sweet piece and analysis that we did on this topic. So it's a policy brief, you see, 6 to 8 pages document. So it's not a long read, and hopefully insightful for you. We also printed out some of these publications. You can find them at the entrance, and of course it is available online. After that, I would be happy to hear some reactions from our panelists. And after that, we can open the discussion and also hear from the participants. I would be happy to keep this as interactive as possible. So please think about your questions as soon as you can. And also for online participants, I would kindly ask you to write your questions as soon as possible so we can address as many of them as possible by the end of today's discussion. Just to note, what we did as part of our research, and I will actually just shift it. So it's called Towards Chemicals Decarbonization, EU Demand-Side Measures to Bridge the Green Premium. So, I mean, this is, you saw this title, and now we have this title. This shouldn't confuse you, I hope so, because this is the title of the policy brief. And here in this policy brief, we try to focus on the demand-side measures in particular. And that's something that I will just say a little bit more about now. But I would also like to have this discussion more broadly about different instruments, how we can decarbonize the chemical sector, so demand side, but also beyond that, and to look at the entire value chain. So starting with just the input to just have a quick spark on the demand side, but we can go beyond that for sure. So I would just say why we were looking at the demand side measures in particular. We recognize that there is something called the green premium in the chemical sector. Costs that result from decarbonization process, and also related policy regulation that is pushing the industry, of course, to go into this direction. So how do we go about the green premium, especially in a strategic sector such as the chemicals industry, how to go about it, how to absorb these costs, and how to distribute it in an adequate way. And given that the chemical sector is a complex sector, there are multiple players there, upstream, downstream, and as I said, the chemical products are intertwined with other sectors, other companies. So we need to be careful when we think about the green premium in particular, while staying true to our decarbonization objectives. When we talk about demand-side measures, as part of this research, we looked at, for example, the role of information, labels, sharing of information that can help to create that demand for low-carbon chemicals. Low-carbon chemicals, think about recycled chemicals, Think about potentially bio-based chemicals. Think about chemicals that are produced with the lower input of fossil fuels in the production process. What is peculiar, of course, or particular about the chemicals is that we don't talk about just carbon in the production process. We talk about carbon feedstock that is also part of the product itself in a conventional way, how you usually produce chemicals, right? I know that some of you may know this already, but just for full awareness. Information and labeling is one important instrument. The other one we were looking at is the demand, is the public procurement as a direct way to create a public demand, so B2G for low carbon chemicals. We were looking into other tools such as investments that you can use public-private investments in a strategic way, so the beneficiaries can in a way be conditioned to source low carbon chemicals if they're the beneficiaries of public investments or public-private when the public investments are like a leverage for private investments. There are also other tools like contracts for difference, where the public sector intervenes with their financial support in case the carbon price goes below the strike price to make it to keep the business case for the industry to invest in clean tech solutions, the upstream, for example, sector, but also across the value chain. We also looked at the taxation. So again, if we address the taxation, the VAT, for example, we could reduce the costs, or actually it would be less expensive. The lower carbon chemical products, which could make them more competitive, and that can create a demand for them, etc. So these are kind of where we will try to kind of map some of the demand side measures that we are talking about, but be mindful also other instruments that are shaping this discussion. The chemicals agenda has been, let's say, the EU has already a very developed and, let's say, rich chemicals agenda for the last couple of decades. So it's not that we are starting from zero when we talk about this, but also what we could observe within the team is that there is still room for improvement and a long way to go to truly account for chemical decarbonization, for industrial decarbonization to begin with, but also for chemical decarbonization, and to devise effective demand-side measures for decarbonization of the chemical sector. So this is not something that you can address with REACH, for example, and other chemical legislation we had thus far. And it wasn't really sufficiently addressed with the Green Industrial Deal. And only now with the Clean Industrial Deal, we see a momentum and more of this understanding and, about the importance of developing these tools. And we have all the experts or policy experts who are following this topic more closely, or even not necessarily that closely. You must be aware of the Industrial Accelerator Act, the developments around the Circular Economy Agenda, the Eco-Design Regulation, the upcoming Circular Economy Act. So the wheels are in motion and lots of things are happening, but arguably, there is more to do to actually see how we shape industrial decarbonization-related instruments. And what we see is that the chemical sector is not sufficiently recognized in this regard. For example, in the Industrial Accelerator Act, we don't have a dedicated focus on the chemicals. It's easier said than done because, of course, it's a complex sector. It ties into others, like also the automotive or the electronics, etc. But it's still not there, and it's a strategic sector. So this is the challenge. When it comes to all of these measures, depends how we integrate them into the public procurement directives or the Industrial Accelerator Act or the Circular Economy Agenda, product design requirements. The challenges are the following. If we look at only one instrument or we do not consider the entire value chain, the risk is that we will not really solve the problem optimally, I would say. So the green premium will be distributed maybe more to the downstream or the upstream sector, or it will be too big, and we can maybe reduce that the green premium if we do it in a more careful way. If we look at different the mix of different policy instruments, and we need to look at that value chain holistically. So if we have a fragmented approach, this will not result in the best possible outcome. The second thing is that if we talk about information tools, instruments, also such as, for example, digital product passports or labeling. First of all, can we really say that this is sufficient to create a demand? Will the consumers, for example, really buy a low-carbon chemical product, I guess finished product, and those who are intermediate or in a B2B, will they really buy it just based on information? And if the economics is not really working in that regard, one can hardly argue in favor of that argument. And one can really hardly say that the chemical producer will get that certainty, predictability to invest in quite expensive clean tech solutions, and this is a long-term commitment. But information tools and labels are important as a way to also support other demand-side measures, such as public procurement, for example, by getting clarity on the information transfer, and making it easier to decide when immediate price is not the only factor to consider in, let's say, typical public procurement environments. The elephant in the room I will highlight here is that when we talk about public procurement, when we talk about contracts for difference, investments, etc., the question is, of course, who pays? Well, the implication is the government. So the taxpayers, or we pay it via, let's say, or via borrowing money to do so. So the public sector will then come in with a higher price for this to compensate in a way to absorb the green premium. And this is a challenge given the fiscal situation in many of the governments, also the EU, the member state level. And these are the trade-offs. Also, I would say there are ways, and we'll come to that we kind of try to iron this out in a way that we find a way to reduce this cost. But the question is, can we really have a cake and eat it too? In this triangle, if you imagine it, can we have both decarbonization, competitiveness of the European chemical sector, but at the same time without any side effects on fiscal policies itself? That is a question, but the question is also what do we consider to be a strategic direction or the way forward? Is the chemical sector a strategic sector or not? Is decarbonization a strategic action for the EU or not? Can be a way to help us to find some of the answers to these challenges. I would also say, in case of contracts for difference, I will come back to that now when I share some of the recommendations. It's the standard, say, typical approach to contracts for difference used in the energy sector is not necessarily something that will immediately work for the chemical sector, because, as I said, their carbon is also the feedstock for products. It's not just fuel to produce the chemical products. So we need to think about a more nuanced way to translate some of the contracts for difference, these practices, into the chemicals sector. Now, what I would like to focus on here is the recommendations. So, as I said, and there is more to it in the paper itself. But just to say, indeed, we need to have that holistic approach. We need to have that value chain perspective. When we talk about different policies, whatever they are, we need to talk about specific, and we need to go to the nitty-gritty, but we need to look at that perspective holistic. And that means more specifically a mix of instruments altogether, and we need to look at the entire value chain. What is the effect on the upstream chemical sector and the downstream chemical sector? That's on a more broader note. On information instruments, we need to standardize carbon accounting. We need to see how we go about the communication, effective communication, data sharing methodologies for chemical products. And that's also one of the challenges for information tools, not just that they're not sufficient to drive the demand, but also we talk about sensitive information, we talk about digital product passports, which information are to be shared, what about business sensitive information, personal data, it's also more generally. There are quite a number of questions before we finalize and develop these tools for information sharing that everybody or most of the stakeholders would be happy to follow. So the other thing is investments in lead markets. So we need to indeed leverage the strategic investments, and let's think about the upcoming European competitiveness fund, and how can we use it to strategically to indirectly create a demand for low carbon chemicals. Public procurement. So There is a case to think about mandatory public procurement requirements for chemicals in particular, and we see now what is happening with the Industrial Accelerator Act, but more on chemicals, I would say. We need to put more emphasis on this, I guess. So be it in terms of targets, concrete requirements on low carbon chemicals, in terms of reporting requirements, in terms of green public procurement criteria. So to go beyond the practices we've been seeing thus far since the public procurement directives were introduced and the green public procurement were introduced in the past. There is another thing to kind of try to reduce this the burden on the public sector. We would suggest to create, and the Critical Chemicals Alliance could be one of these actors to potentially to develop, to push forward this initiative, is to propose the creation of the EU demand aggregation platform for low carbon chemical inputs. So to kind of try to in a way coordinate public procurement across different levels of governance, which can help to come up with better solutions. It can create more predictability for chemical producers to invest in the long run if there is more transparency, more predictability in this regard, and it could help with the cost argument, and given that governments are struggling with their budgets. Contracts for difference. So I talked about the typical contracts for difference. So the carbon price goes below strike point, strike price. The government comes in with subsidies basically to compensate and to make the long-term investments into clean tech still economically viable. And this is linked to the ETS, to the carbon price, what the carbon price is, and you can determine how low it should fall to have this public intervention, etc. It can go the other way around, by the way. But there is another interesting point to consider, which is called the double auction contracts for difference. We took note of, for example, a case in Germany that was applied for hydrogen, for clean hydrogen in particular, where there is an intermediary, established intermediary, that makes a long-term contract with the upstream chemical producers, which gives more certainty and helps to absorb some of the high costs for the introduction of clean chemical solutions, the production of these solutions. But then the intermediary resells these products that are bought from the upstream, resells at commercial prices on a short-term contract basis with the downstream sector. So again, we talk about the fact that the governments pay for this difference, but it's a way to also create a demand for upstream sector to decarbonize, but without transferring the green premium to the downstream sector with the intervention of these intermediary and, of course, in the background, the intervention of the government. Food for thought. And taxation, we now have the Green VAT initiative, for example, as part of its development. Maybe we can specify it and bring it, introduce some of the low carbon requirements for chemicals, and we link to the reduction of the VAT to create a demand for these solutions. So yeah, that is basically what we were, what we came up with. I'm more than happy for you to raise questions, of course, to challenge us on any of these points, and to add on top of this. As I said, this event is not just about demand side, but we wanted to add this, and happy to hear any additional suggestions more broadly. What can we do, and what can the EU do to advance both decarbonization and competitiveness in the chemicals sector? So thank you. Now I'm bringing back my moderator's hat on, and maybe Alexis, we could start with you. If you have any reactions, any reflections on top of what I said, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for setting the scene for today. I mean, you did it in a very clear way, and your policy recommendations are also very clear. So thank you for that. Let me start with introducing myself. So my name is Alexis van Maercke. I've been Director General of the Detergents Association since more than 2 years now. And before that, I've been in different trade associations in Brussels and in the Commission and in the European Parliament. Now, I think this is a very important debate today. And so let me start maybe with a couple of facts and figures of the detergents sector and detergents industry. So in our sector, you have two major components. You have the consumer products, so the products that you can buy in the supermarkets, the cleaning products. We have a few international and also European brands that are also present in the room today. And then there is a professional sector. The professional sector are the cleaning products, the disinfectants that are being used in hospitals, in schools, in hotels, restaurants, but also in food production sites, for example. We have a market value of approximately 45 billion euro a year and more or less 100,000 employees. Now, you mentioned the Chemicals Action Plan, and if you read the first sentence of the Chemical Action Plans, it clearly says the chemical industry is the industry of the industry. It contributes to 96% of the manufactured goods in Europe. And in the 96%, you also have detergents. So we are a good customer of the chemical industry, I can say. And we are very much happy that the chemical industry is in the focus right now. And I think our colleagues from Cefic have done an amazing work and job to put this topic on the agenda. And this has eventually led to the Clean Industrial Deal. It has led to the Chemicals Action Plan. But of course, it's important that we also consider sufficiently the downstream users. So the downstream users are, you have a wide variety, from the steel sector to the detergents, to cosmetics, home appliance, and so on. Now, if you look further on in the communication, you also see the reference to the Chemical Omnibus. The Chemical Omnibus is focusing on fertilizers, cosmetics, and detergents and paints, for example. And that is, of course, by definition, downstream focused. But we think that if you look at the lead markets discussion and the Critical Chemical Alliance, that we should make sure that downstream users, which are in fact the customers of the chemical industry, that they also have a seat at the table and a voice. When it comes to the lead markets, we are very supportive to lead markets. We believe this is part of the future. But to scale up, there are a few challenges. So the first one is the availability. So if you look at, and I will give a very concrete example, bioplastics. So there is a production of bioplastics, which I think is 500,000 tons per year, whereas the demand for plastics is 54 million tons per year. So there is a mismatch between offer and demand, and it's even on a ratio 1 by 100. So then there is also, and you may refer to that, Stefan, the price issue, obviously. So sustainable feedstock. So you can have fossil-based feedstock, you can have sustainable, renewable, and so on. Well, the price of a renewable or sustainable is up to 1.2 slash 4.2 multiplied, so a factor. So I mean, up to 4 times more expensive. So that is something to consider. And obviously, we cannot just say that surplus, we pass it on to the consumer. That's not how it works, because what is really important is that a consumer will also make his own assessment. And a consumer will not necessarily buy a product that is more important. And that's where the green premium comes in. Now, Stefan, you have listed the number of policy options. And let me focus on 3. So green public procurement, this is high on the agenda here in Brussels. We expect something in Q2, if I'm not mistaken. And green public procurement, that's for our professional business, is fundamental. Because if you have a public hospital, you can clearly say, instead of focusing on the price, you focus on the sustainability credentials of a cleaning products. And there's a massive opportunity there to render our professional sector more green, or by using more sustainable feedstock. VAT, it's not easy. Obviously, you need unanimity. I think there was last year or 2 years ago a case in the digital industry where they managed to have unanimity, but it's not always easy. And then there is a double auction system, the contracts for difference. And I mean, that idea is gaining traction. I think I'm pleased to see that EPC has highlighted that, but also in the European Parliament, there's MEP Chaim, if I'm not mistaken, in the report has put forward that idea. And I think it's very valuable, and we are very much supportive. And before passing on the floor to my colleagues here on stage, I would like to say a few things about, again, the detergents themselves. So we have been the subject of heavy regulation in recent years. So if you go to the supermarket and you buy detergents, everything which you see on that product has been regulated in the last 4 years. So the packaging has been regulated through the packaging and packaging waste regulation. The formulation, so the content, has been regulated by our Lex Specialis, which is the detergents regulation, which was now published in the official journal in March. And also the labels, so that's the entire product, is also, that's called CLP, Classification and Labeling of Packaging, is also regulated. And it was regulated in such a way that we now have an omnibus. So after 2 years, we are now seeing an omnibus, and we are actually in the middle of the end of the co-decision, I would say. We are close to a deal, and I will stop here and to set the scene on behalf of the detergents industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexis. Yeah, just before we move on, one question also on what you said also is about a very important topic on availability itself, or let's say alternative materials or products to the ones that are considered with the carbon, that come with the carbon footprint, such as bioplastics or bio-based materials that can then feed into more, let's say, lower carbon chemicals. And what you also mentioned, that the price, roughly speaking, the price is say 4 times. Do you have any insights or any information based on what you could observe thus far? If the availability of these materials, resources, and products, is this in a way caused, or mostly the lack of availability caused by the price itself? Is there any other factor that exists on its own, regardless? Because one could argue that because if it's so expensive, then it kind of, the signal goes down the market that you simply do not put an effort, not just on the business, but the government. Nobody really, they would just say this is more expensive, doesn't make any sense. And that's why, is this the cause of a lack of availability, or is there something else that we could continue to be mindful of beyond the cost itself, or how does these two interact, if something you can share?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think everybody here on the table will agree that we should aim at having a bigger cake. So that's for sure. Everybody will agree on that. What we face on the market is also competition between sectors. So, for example, aviation fuels is subsidized, gets tax exemptions, and of course they are eating part of the cake. And so that means that the availability is limited for our sector. So that's one element which contributes to a higher price, because the less demand you have, the less offer you have, the higher the price, obviously. So I think that is a major factor. And well, I would say let's focus on that right now, and I think, but there are many other factors as well, and I'm happy to come back in the next round.
But very insightful, just to kind of consider the bigger picture and what we need to consider one way or another, and before we think about solutions. So thank you for that. And hope I'm back. So, Nicola, maybe we could hear from you if you have any additional observations and reflections on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the invitation, and thanks also for the excellent work. Maybe I should put it like this; it just comes into my mouth. So. Thanks for the presentation and the insights. So maybe a few words also from my side in terms of how we are approaching the issue. And it might be obvious for most of you, but I think if you don't put this the scene, we don't set it from the beginning, we might get a bit lost into the details afterwards. What is the challenge that the chemical industry is having in moving forward? Well, up until now, the decarbonisation pattern has been pretty much following energy efficiency measures, which have been having a payback time. So that you do the investment, then you have a payback time, and then it makes sense. So from a business point of view, you might be more or less happy to do it, but at least you do it, and then you can explain to your board why you're doing it and why it makes sense. In moving forward for this deep decarbonisation pattern, the options that we have ahead, they're pretty much clear. Electrification, carbon capture and storage, biomethane, hydrogen, all of them, they account. The sector is so heterogeneous that you can pick any and you can always find an application. The point is that all these options have in common that they end up into higher OPEX. So that means that the products become automatically more expensive because the more you produce, the higher is the cost. And this is that is what is leading us to the discussion today. With this higher cost, someone needs to pay for it. And if, as we just heard from Alexis, the consumers, on the other hand, they're not prepared to pay for that premium because they don't see themselves recognition in the market, then where do we place the boundaries? So that's a bit of the issue that we are trying to face over the past at least couple of years. And that is, we need to create a business case for these products. Now, there are two ways to do it, not necessarily alternative, but either you find a way to reduce the cost of producing, or you need to pass it on down the value chain, or something in between. But these are the levers that we have. So on the energy part, you've seen we have been putting forward ideas to say, do we want to use electricity? Okay, electricity is too expensive for us to do fuel switching. Let's try to agree on a target to reduce electricity prices for industry at 50 euro megawatt hour, all costs included. At that price, most of the low carbon products can be produced at cost competitive prices. I don't know if you've seen the reaction from the power sector. Extremely hysteric. No way, you cannot do it. Okay, so the energy part, we cannot manage it. On the downstream is where the demand, the discussion starts, and you've been mentioning a lot of the tools that are there. I think they all have pros and cons, and there is no single market for chemicals. So they have different markets, different solutions might apply, and we need to find the right tools. Of course, being 90% of the value chain, it becomes a bit complicated to identify which is the single tool that makes the biggest shift. They all contribute, but maybe one point I'd like to stress is let's not make confusion between sustainable feedstock and low carbon product. Are not necessarily the same thing. Sustainable feedstock, so we talk about bio-based feedstock, recycled feedstock, carbon capture and use. There might be good reasons, good externalities that we are trying to address in promoting these products, and we have many companies working on it, and we are working on it, and many policy tools in that direction. But if I look at it from a carbon emissions point of view, from the energy balance point of view, all these alternative feedstocks, they require energy, and we need to see what is the energy required, how much energy do they need, what are the CO2 associated to those production processes, to what extent we can replace those emissions with alternative energy carriers, and then to do the math. So that's where. And also we've done some studies looking in 2050, and we don't have, and going back to Alexis' point of view, availability, we don't arrive to 100% of alternative feedstock in our industry because of limits with bio-based feedstock, because of limits with the recycling. That means that we still have a large portion of the traditional feedstock that needs to be sorted out also. That is, so we need to look, when you look at the low carbon products, it's not necessarily the idea that if you have sustainable feedstock, automatically it's a low carbon product and therefore it has a path. So getting the two things together is not an easy equation. We need to find a solution that enable the industries that are also using, let's say, traditional feedstock, that are nowadays the largest majority, and will still remain a significant amount of installations also in the future, to find a recognition so that if you start investing in low carbon production, if you start investing in CCS, if you start investing maybe progressively in electrification, well, that product gets the recognition also in the market. And it is... my eyes is the most difficult part, because if we look at what we have in our society, and I go to the end users, you can sell 100% recycled product. There is a market for that, consumers recognize it. Maybe 100% bio-based product. but 100% low carbon product which has a 30% savings, it doesn't work. So it's and it's something which is also progressively reducing over time. You don't have a low carbon product in one shot because it's either at zero carbon, or if it's a low carbon, you need to go from today to tomorrow, and that will be reducing over time. So we need to understand what are the steps required to identify what is a low carbon product, and how do we go from today to tomorrow in a way which creates a business case for the producers.
But maybe just to clarify on this, you wouldn't see that like any role of targets or anything that could help you, that there are expectations looking ahead in terms of this transition, because you say if it's from day to tomorrow, it at least to clarify, it sounds a bit something like incremental, but is it coupled with still a long-term vision as to how we move towards low carbon products?
Yeah, thanks. Let me clarify. The vision is there. It's just a matter of how we're going to do it. Yeah. And there are different tools that needs to be put in place. We need to see what are the most cost-effective ways of doing it. I'm not ruling out anything. So what you mentioned, I think they all have merits and pros and cons. At the end of the day, it's really a matter of how do we find a way to pass on this cost. And there is the consumer, there is the taxpayers you were mentioning, and then something in between. And from our perspective, it's also a matter of adding different policy layers on top of each other. Because so far, the decarbonisation has been first primarily climate-driven. Then we have created the energy dimension on top of it with the renewable targets and so forth. Now we need to put also the industrial dimension in it. Understanding that the way we are marching today, just putting a price on CO2, that's not going to solve the problems. So we need to find a way to add that industrial dynamics, which requires additional policies on top of it.
Thank you so much. And what comes across the panel is indeed it's one of among a number of things you mentioned is the question of availability of these alternative materials. But what you then also add on top of that is the question of is also about sustainable feedstock and what it takes, and that it also comes with a footprint. So we need to kind of think about it from different angles in that sense, but also the other questions around, for example, the energy costs, electrification, and that's a very interesting topic on its own because it goes into the question of energy, the electricity market, and we had that debate a couple of years ago, and of course depends whom you ask, you get a different answer, and for us it's always interesting to see can we to an extent reconcile different interests and different priorities in that sense, because it's the question of high electricity price, but it's also driven, there is a reason why we have high electricity price. If we change it, we need to think about the long-term effects on the path of decarbonization, but also the energy cost. But there are short-term considerations, more mid to short-term considerations of the electricity cost for the chemicals industry. So it's a very interesting topic, and happy to see how we can explore it further. But for now, I think it's great to have this insights already, and I would be happy to hear from you, Florie, about any additional points you would like to add on top of what we heard thus far, or anything on the paper itself.
Thank you for the very good discussion so far. And I will focus my remarks as requested on lead markets, which is a very timely topic. As Agora Industry, we are part of Working Group 4 of the Critical Chemicals Alliance, which is now busy formulating proposals in that context. Lead markets, from our point of view, should really be considered as part of a wider policy package that also encompasses other key policies for the transformation of the chemical sector, like the EU ETS, the discussion around the possible extension of CBAM in the future, but also all the public support part of the discussion, which you're also looking at in your paper. So this is one of the good things of the Critical Chemicals Alliance, is that this is really looking at what are the relevant policy measures, taking really a sectoral point of view. The only thing being that the CCA is more focused on restoring the competitiveness of the chemical sector and looking less maybe at important policy instruments like the EU ETS. so the Industrial Accelerator Act is really the policy vehicle that, and I would even say next generation of policies that is really bringing these lean markets into life. It's not always an easy discussion. We see the same in other sectors of the economy, because we are getting very close to the market and therefore touching commercial interests of companies. Which can even make it difficult for the sector as a whole to have a clear and unified position. As was mentioned by my colleagues, chemicals have various specificities. The first, as you rightly mentioned in your report, that we are dealing with very complex and intertwined value chains. And this is why, possible integration of the chemical sector into CBAM has really proved to be a headache so far for the Commission. And the second thing, as was mentioned, is that unlike maybe steel or cement, it's really a two-dimensional discussion with, on the one hand, the low carbon aspect, how we reduce the overall footprint of chemicals production, but also how we progressively substitute the fossil carbon content in organic chemicals with non-fossil content. And as Nicola rightly mentioned, these objectives, they go sometimes along. Sometimes there can be trade-offs. And therefore, I would also say it's important to consider them separately. So for low carbon chemicals, as we said earlier, complex and interrelated value chains mean that defining what is a low carbon chemical or not is not that an easy exercise. Even for steel, they are doing it now. The Commission is now busy defining what low carbon steel means through the ESPR, notably. And this is proving quite, not an easy discussion. So you can imagine for chemicals how it will be. And I think we need to recognize that it will take time and that it will need to be done in progressive steps. So one consequence of that is that maybe in the shorter term it will be easier to focus on direct emissions of the sector. Or indirect emissions, scope 2 emissions, rather than having immediately the ambition to trace greenhouse gas footprint across the entire value chain, including scope 3. And the second thing is that, ensuring full traceability of emissions and relating it to a final product on the end market might be feasible for a number of products, for example, related to public procurement. But as we know, also public procurement is unlikely to deliver the huge volumes needed for the chemical sector in order really to provide the sufficient signal for investments that is now urgently needed. So therefore, this is why the Critical Chemicals Alliance is now also, Working Group 4 is also trying to think a bit more creatively what can be the other tools that can create that certainty in the shorter term. For chemicals from sustainable carbon, the EU regulatory toolkit is already more advanced, as we know. Packaging and packaging waste regulation was mentioned. End-of-life vehicles with recycled content target is another example. In the future, ESPR, is now the vehicle for implementing the IEA on steel, could also be an interesting way forward. There are a few aspects that still remain open for discussion, though, around the methodology, about how we trace this non-fossil carbon content in products, with difficult discussions around mass balance, book and claim. So we are not completely there yet, and this will be really an important detail, but important aspect for policies. And also which sort of carbon, alternative sources of carbon we want to promote within the EU regulatory toolkit. Moving forward, I would mention a few points that are important from our perspective.
Can I just briefly ask, when you mentioned the alternative types of carbon and the choices we need to make, can you maybe say a little bit more in terms of what are the concerns or priorities, something that we should be mindful of? When
I will come back to it.
Yeah, okay.
That's on my list.
It's a deal.
So, no worry. So, So first point I would like to emphasize is that, in my point of view at least, end market is really the current missing link into this, let's say, policy or enabling framework for investments into clean chemicals. And we see this also. This is a bit the stumbling block that we see for in the debate around potential inclusion of chemicals in CBAM, is that there would always be downstream circumvention if you put it higher up in the value chain, like we see in other sectors like steel, and where the Commission is trying to close the loop. But for chemicals, again, it's more dealing with more complex value chains. But we need to have, let's say, the final products into the loop in the end, because from our perspective, that will be the only way to make sure that cost of the transition can be passed through down to the consumers. We don't see how the investments can be delivered. So from our perspective, this is an important element of the equation. Also, as I said earlier, I mean, short-term, simpler measures that don't fully trace the carbon or the footprint of the products enter the value chains need to be considered. We still believe that in the longer term, it is very important that the market will be able to recognize or to have the necessary information to identify whether a product is low carbon, so that you really have this kind of labeling instruments around chemicals products. So, and that should not be only a vague and long-term aspiration. And we believe that, we hope that the Commission will have really a clear work plan in place to make sure that this happens, and that in the mid to long term and progressively, starting maybe with a few restricted value chains, this can be mainstream to the entire chemical sector. Regarding fossil carbon substitution, you asked earlier. So biomass tends to be the cheapest option for substituting fossil carbon, because it requires rather limited adaptation to processes in the chemical sector. So when the Commission will consider possible additional policies or measures to promote use of biomass in the chemical sector, we believe it is important that this does not lead to cannibalization of existing investments and targets related to recycled carbon content. So that's why, from our point of view, it would rather make sense to have separate targets, at least in the first place, to make sure that all sources can compete for investments. Related to that, I think, access to alternative carbon sources was mentioned by Alexis. I would very much like to support this statement. Today, the cascading principle for biomass is in the EU legislation, but not really implemented. And I would say that now the discussion and the debate that is opening around the post-2030 energy framework is really a not to be missed opportunity to really assess where we want to direct these scarce resources, like biomass, to the sectors where they can be used most cost effectively. Last but not least, we cannot talk about lean markets without discussing EU-made. So there we tend to take a rather differentiated approach, looking on the one hand at basic industries and energy-intensive sectors that have already well-established value chains, versus newer technologies where we are not completely self-sufficient, and where, therefore, it makes sense to take maybe a more cautious approach. But looking, really at the collapse of value chain for chemicals in the recent years, we believe that having a discussion around EU-made and low-carbon chemicals is a discussion worth having to make sure that we can really secure the much needed investments into the chemical sector transformation.
Thank you so much for sharing these valuable points, Florie, and also just the last point that indeed, now we are in the process of discussing, trying to figure out what do we mean by made in EU based on the proposed Industrial Accelerator Act, and it's interesting to be part of that discussion on the interplay between low carbon requirements and local requirements, and can this be used under what conditions to strengthen the competitiveness and resilience of our industry, also in Europe. I'm not gonna repeat everything that you mentioned, but just some points that are interesting to consider. Yeah, that what you mentioned, it's not just about traditional versus alternative feedstock, but it can also be alternative versus alternative feedstock in certain situations, and we need to see how, when there is a case and when we transit from traditional feedstock to one, how do we do it in a strategic and a tactful way, because it's not the same. It's not the same. We're talking about biomass versus recycled, etc. But also the question of availability and implementation of the policies we already have on biomass. It's all the questions that remain to be answered, and also what you also said, and building also what Nicola was mentioning, it's easier said than done to find your way around these two priorities. One is low carbon in the context of production itself. The other one is the sustainable feedstock itself, and that there are these challenges and how you prioritize what you do about it, and very important for the chemical sector in particular. So I would be happy to come back with some questions, and also if there are any immediate reactions from the panelists, but just looking at the audience and also our online audience, if you already have any immediate questions, I would be more than happy to hear you out, or any comments, any additional inputs, anything, contributions from your perspective, what you heard from all of the panelists, also on the paper itself, thinking about the chemical sector on different parts of the value chain, and also the decarbonization versus and together with competitiveness. How can we go about this? Anything on the business perspective, on the civil society perspective, any policy reflections or recommendations for the policymakers? I would say in principle there are no stupid questions. Don't be shy. We are very much open and conducive to different views, and I think we have first volunteer to break the ice. Please.
Thank you. Peter Wojcik, also from the chemical industry. In the last 3-4 years, the European chemical industry has lost some 10% of its capacity, also due to high energy costs, high feedstock costs. That has been an issue for many years already, but now, due to the global situation, geopolitical crisis, also due to own cost factors that we have created in Europe, the outlook is bleak with regard to investment and with regard to competitiveness. And I'm in charge of industrial policy and competitiveness in our organization. What kind of policy models would we need beyond what we have just discussed, the list of topics? we should also look maybe to outside Europe, other regions where the chemical industry is growing in comparison. What do we do differently? What should we learn from others? It's something that is maybe sometimes missing in the discussion in Brussels.
Can you just say from which organization are you coming from?
Also from Cefic.
Also from Cefic, yeah. No, but indeed, I think it's a very relevant question. If we can be in a way inspired also by other cases, that we shouldn't just run in circle when it comes to our policies, but see what's happening out there and what are the reasons for industrialization or deindustrialization and different reasons for success or challenges in specific markets. Thank you. I don't know if there is any immediate question on top of what we heard now or not. We can come back to the panel. I will save this question, and I'm inviting everybody to address this. But Nicola, I'm also looking at you. But Alexis, I saw that you were taking a number of notes yourself, and I don't know if you have anything to respond already to what you heard. I think we had discussed a lot about, for example, low carbon in terms of production process, but also sustainable feedstock and trade-offs or tensions around that. I don't know if maybe you have any points or reflections on this in particular, any other responses to what we heard from thus far from the audience or the panelists.
Yeah. So the question that you raised is a very valid one. I think the regions that are growing are mainly the regions where there are less rules. Let's be honest. So in the case of, I will speak for our sector, key ingredients are enzymes. So enzymes are a fundamental ingredient in our business. They have a value of €2 billion a year, but due to complicated REACH legislation, there are a lot of limitations, and we cannot use it. So we also notice that a lot of regions are actually copying REACH, so Korea and others. So I think there are good things in what we do, but also problems that we can fix. That said, as far as the other questions that were raised and the challenges that we see, for example, I mentioned consumer preference. So we have a service, and there you actually see that what is now the key point for consumers? The key point for consumers is efficiency of the product. So when they buy a detergent, they go to a supermarket, they say the most efficient product is what they will buy. The second is price, and the third one is sustainability. So, and then if you ask further and you ask consumers, but would you be interested in purchasing a more sustainable detergent? 76% will say yes, but only 26% will effectively will do that in practice. So I think that is one of the challenges. And the other challenge that we face, and it's I would say, the functional performance of certain ingredients that we have. So I would say a more sustainable feedstock product will not necessarily have the same functionalities as a product that is fossil-based. And to make it very concrete, so surfactants are being used as a key component of or ingredient in our products. Well, the bio-based surfactants will not necessarily have the same properties and the same effect. So those are additional things that play a role. So just to start.
Are there any potential synergies that you could observe between the efficiency and sustainability at the same time? Not saying that this is a standard or something to expect by default, but if there are any cases of, let's say, that one can go together. It's very interesting what you said about, because I'm aware about that sometimes cost doesn't always come first, but it's not something that we can expect that this is the general always attitude from the consumer. So it's interesting to see how they are prioritizing their choices, and I don't know if there is something that we can also look at some synergies in this case, in the case of some products, or is it always a trade-off to be expected between the first and the third preference?
That's not an easy question. I think if the answer would be obvious, we would not be sitting here. I think so. Let's be very honest. I think there is a lot of R&D happening in Europe. We have research centers very close to Brussels, even from one of our biggest members. And I mean, it's really high-end R&D that is happening. So, but obviously the silver bullet does not exist, and there is also always a trade-off. And so what I mentioned, the bio-based surfactants, well, the results when you do cold washes, which became very important recently when we had the energy crisis, a lot of people wanted to wash at cold temperature. Well, the bio-based surfactants does not always have the same reaction. So that is one of the practical things that we need to. So it's not just a matter of price, but it's also a matter of functional performance of ingredients.
Also, a reminder about the importance of the life cycle assessment, and that the answers to the question what is more sustainable is not always intuitive in that sense, because one needs to look at all of the phases of the life cycle itself. I don't know, Nicola, if you have any responses on this or any other points being raised thus far?
Thanks. So maybe a couple of reflections following the discussion we had. Indeed, the last point that Alexis was mentioning, I think it's often a bit under-evaluated. Like, why do we make products? In the first place is because we need to meet the needs of the end consumers. So there is a matter of trends that are going there, and if we are making a new product or providing a new product, it needs to have some superior performance with the previous one. So that is an embedded part, and that's where usually most of the R&D goes in our companies, is to make a more performant product, something which is meeting new challenges that society is requiring. At the same time, we are a B2B business. Usually you should not buy chemicals off the shelf and do your own stuff. That means that the traceability and the recognition of the products across the value chain is not that straightforward. I had a company once was visiting a company, was saying, you know how many chemicals you need to make a microchip? So, I have no idea. More than 500. Okay, so from that on, I started using the AI tools now to take pictures of clothes and how many chemicals we need. And you go into the hundreds, and then again, having 100 chemicals and then in a product, and then you have two that are sustainable, let's say, and 98 which are not. Like it's not the one that's going to make a big difference. So we need to understand what are the markets in itself, what are the needs, where it's more relevant, where it's less relevant. But yet the point is, how do we get this low carbon recognition, which is an intrinsic part of the product? The product performs the same. So how do we sell that element there in a context in which this product is more expensive? And it was mentioned also by Alexis, cost comes second in that. So you need to have a superior product, but then if they're not prepared to pay for the cost, then where are we stuck? Which brings me to the second point. You were mentioning, we were talking about in the options. Also, we talk about carbon contract for difference. Now, just a word of caution in there, because this is a concept we borrow from the power sector. The concept is there. You can easily understand to a contract for difference. Okay, you take a striking price. Now, the fundamental assumption when we engage the carbon contract for difference is that with the passing of time, we are getting towards a market which is functioning. So we are opening up for some cost reduction. So we've seen in the renewables that we do every time new auctioning with new striking price. We try to get lower, or if you don't want to do it lower, because you want to follow other policies which are differentiating or want to support certain technologies. But the fundamental assumption is that by doing that, by providing public funding, you are unlocking a system which is then supposed to deliver something which is self-sustained in a market. Now, we need to have that end point into consideration, because public financing is not unlimited. So that requires some funding. And then we need to understand what is the time horizon. Because if this crossing between these new solutions and the market never arrives, then we are basically developing a never-ending subsidized society, which again, from a financial point of view, I think it's quite utopistic. So the tools needs to, it's okay to identify what are the tools, but also we need to understand what is the end point. If we keep on having high energy cost for our production facilities, well, then that crossing market never ends unless you decide to ramp up the cost for consumers to the point where then you start meeting this crossing point. Yeah, I'm not saying that this is the goal, but just to keep it in mind that sometimes we try to apply solutions with the expectation that because we do it, because somewhere else has happened, then it will cascade also in other segments of the economy. That might not be the case in this discussion.
And what Florie also mentioned, if we add another spice into this dish, which is the local content requirements, so we have efficiency, question of cost, sustainability, but we also have another public request or rising demand for local content in the context of economic security. I don't know if there are any points or any positions or anything you can share at this point in terms of how does decarbonization mix with local content requirement, and can we think about it as a potential synergy for greater competitiveness, or what are the potential pitfalls we should be aware of in that process?
It's a very difficult discussion that we're having in our family in the chemical industry because of the heterogeneity of the sector. Depending on where are you sitting along the value chain, you might have different approaches to what you consider to be made in Europe. There are just two issues, maybe more general. One is we want to make sure that if you're doing all this, in the case of sustainable feedstock, that this is happening in Europe. At the moment, we are collecting plastic, sending them to China, recycle and send them back. Bio-based products, I was told by one company in the down the value chain that they were doing amazing bio-based products, 100% bio-based in India, which is good for them, but it doesn't really help us from a European perspective. So that element in there, we need to do something which also is accompanied by measures to stimulate and to let the market grow also in Europe, not exclusively in Europe, but at least let's give it a chance. And secondly, it's also a matter of how do we set the targets along the way, because there needs to be something between ambitious and credible. We've seen many times in the past recent years when we have given a very ambitious target. Give an example of hydrogen. We want to have a lot of hydrogen, but it needs to be green. It needs to be from renewable electricity produced only when the wind turbine is turned. So basically nobody's investing. So that's when you say, okay, let's do something which can be scaled up, gives the time to industry to adapt, to be ambitious, to see that there is something beyond. But let's not just go immediately for an ambitious target that then we can only meet by importing products from elsewhere.
No, thank you very much for these reflections. And I mean, also just to say in terms of local content and what in practice, what happens in terms of there is an interesting link with the electricity market, with the energy as to the previous statements you made, but also good to kind of be mindful how does the chemicals ecosystem relate to the broader environment with circular economy, for example, and what we are discussing about that, not just on chemicals, but also on other products, on other commodities. Lots of used products go to somewhere else, being recycled and resold back, and we cannot even trace it because of a number of issues, also customs codes, etc. And it's interesting to see how do we think about these other agendas as a way to help, to an extent, maybe to strengthen our recycling capacities in Europe, which I know is easier said than done, but in a way, that issue and that challenge, I would argue, could in a way be tackled by also looking into the environment, let's say, around the system we are currently tackling. So why does these used products or waste, why does it go somewhere else and then being imported? Are we importing our own used products, recycled, and can we change it? And that's a very interesting discussion when it comes to circular economy more specifically, and also a very interesting point on the potential, like how I understood it at least, the importance of a potential cutoff period for contracts for difference. Then we know how far are we going with this and what is the timeline and what are we actually trying to do, what the actual concrete targets and objectives are, so that we find that balance between public investments and what we are trying to achieve. Looking at you, Florie, I don't know if you would like to add something.
Yeah, maybe starting from the earlier point on how are our competitors doing and why are they more successful. I really don't think we can boil this down to just deregulating. I mean, of course, that's part of the discussions, and maybe we tend to over-engineer things in Europe. But if you take the example of China, and I followed a very interesting presentation on this recently, I think, they really have well articulated and thought through industrial policy around a few key concepts, which I cannot name now in Chinese, but one of them was that you align the entire society behind your objective. So the moment you have decided that you want to scale up value chains, biochemicals, whatever, you name it, you put all the machine behind that objective and really take this as a societal goal and not only, through a piecemeal approach. And I think this is one of the main success factors of the Chinese policy. And that is also why I think it is illusional to think that we can enable the transformation of the chemical sector in Europe without somehow involving consumers. And that's also why, we discussed the fact that there is limited willingness to pay from consumers for more sustainable but more expensive chemicals. We discussed that public finance is limited, so we cannot have it all financed through public funding. And last, we hear often from the chemical sector that one of the reasons they don't want to be into the CBAM is that there would be downstream circumvention. So the only way you can solve that equation is covering the full value chain and regulating to make sure that the cost can be passed through to the final consumer. I know this, and that is also a way to create this level playing field between imports and domestic production. I know this creates some concerns on how this will impact the demand for these products, which I understand. From our perspective, back to taking this societal view, that's also part of the debate around demand moderation, which we don't have any problem discussing, but I understand it might be more difficult concept to deal with for the industry. But if we want a society that is aligned with the climate neutrality targets, I think this is the kind of discussions that we cannot avoid. This being said, of course, and this is an important part of the discussion in the Critical Chemicals Alliance, and the working group on lead markets, which market do we want to prioritize? We have looked at several parameters and criteria how to prioritize those markets. One of them, which I think is absolutely essential, is how we can focus measures on end markets where the price effect can be most diluted. So where you will have the lowest cost effect on the final product. I think that makes totally sense. But again, I don't think we can transform our industry and reach our climate neutrality targets without having any cost path to final consumers.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Happy to react to that, to what has been said before. And so I fully agree with Nicola that we cannot be in a fully subsidized society and nor in a planned economy like in China. So, but I think if you see the geopolitical developments like the Iran-US war that you have now, actually leads to a number of developments, especially because upstream you cannot keep on passing on the bill to downstream users. So there are limits to that because otherwise you're not profitable anymore. So that brings me to the topic of the targets, obviously. And so the targets can be an instrument. And I mentioned before that we have had our detergents regulation adopted. And in that regulation, you have the Commission will work on a report which will be duly impact assessed, where you may have sustainable feedstock targets or renewable targets in the future. And so I think during the negotiations, we also played as industry our role. So we were open to certain level of targets, but only in the lex specialis. That means in the piece of legislation which is dealing with our sector. And this we are ready to accept. However, if we broaden this and we end up in a critical chemical alliance which has been created, and I think we fully support the creation of the critical chemical alliance, where in a very short time you actually kind of give recommendations on which industries should be targeted, we see a danger because those policy recommendations, although they are not legislation, may fit in legislation. So therefore we are saying, look at the existing instruments that you have. In our case, it's the detergents regulation. Do better regulation, stick to that. We have a clear future plan, and which is also predictable for our industry. Our lines will be adapted. Our R&Ds have started working on that. And so let's stick to that plan for our sector, and then we will be able to deliver. And that will work, and part of our industry will have sustainable feedstock. But we should be careful not with having a proliferation of targets in the Circular Economy Act and in other instruments, and then you end up with a lot of legal uncertainty, whereas we just had clarity now, and let's stick to that.
Yeah, so the importance of also case-by-case approach and trying to see how to build on the existing legislation and something in an environment which is already there, but to kind of be mindful of the details and the specifics about that, because the broader legislation is there is a risk that the implementation there can be also negative potential side effects. Good to be mindful of that. I'm again looking at the audience, and I think we have a question from our gentleman to my left.
Rupert Posner from Unilever. And just to build on Alexis' point, I think the important thing to understand is we're looking at what needs to happen to the chemical industry, but we also need to look at those end markets and what's relevant for them. So one of the things that's really important, for instance, is using bio-based feedstocks is more useful to go into chemicals that biodegrade and the emissions go into the atmosphere. And so that's the most useful area where we can get the biggest greenhouse savings, is by putting them in there. So for example, in detergents, you wouldn't be wanting to be looking at packaging. That's not the relevant area. And in fact, there is already legislation for packaging, and using recycled content is the way to continue to keep the circularity there. So the trick is to make sure that we think about each market differently and what's relevant. How can we use existing legislation? But also the pathway for detergents, for example, is to shift to bio-based feedstocks for the chemical ingredients, because that's a fundamental problem that industry has. But you wouldn't be necessarily wanting to emphasise putting bio-based feedstocks into packaging, which can be recycled and is already covered by existing legislation.
May I just ask a question back to you? There was also a comment that when we are thinking about the bio-based feedstock, that there are potential trade-offs in terms of the uptake of recycled materials, or it depends on a particular subsector that we are talking about.
So if we're talking about recycled to go into packaging, we're all doing that. That's increasing. So there's no reason why we can't continue on that pathway. The idea of using bio-based into what's actually in the bottle rather than the bottle itself is probably where more of the bio-based feedstock should be focused on delivering. Because one of the key things is essentially consumers pay for everything. So it's either higher prices from products that come from us or taxes that are being paid. And so, as Nicola said, this has got to be an investment. And so that's the idea of contract for differences. We need to be looking at mechanisms that drive the greatest efficiency so that we can transition the chemical industry to be providing these lower emission chemicals at a lower cost. Those costs have got to go down the same way that we've invested in renewable energy and other technologies. We need to be thinking about these policies as a way to drive those costs down and get the best value for consumers, because consumers are paying for everything, whether it's lower company returns, whether it's their taxes that they're paying or the prices that they pay in the shops.
No, thanks for that, and also kind of a search for notes of optimism in a sense, because we discussed the trade-offs between different alternative feedstock, but that it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Depends a bit on the topic, the issue we are targeting. Sometimes we can just say the answer is relatively straightforward in terms of one sustainable feedstock versus the other, and the other one, like the packaging, we can discuss more the recycled versus the other, but that it doesn't always have to be that collision, but we can also see how we prioritize in view of the best possible outcome on the use of sustainable feedstock. Although again, the chemical sector is extremely complex, so there is no easy answer. But it's good to be mindful of that case. I don't know if there are any other questions for now. I believe there is. And I'm maybe looking for one more. There is one more question, then we can go back to the panel. Please.
Hi, sorry. Chloe Gibert, I'm a consultant at DGA Group. I was wondering, we touched upon it a little bit when you spoke about mass balance accounting. I was wondering what role you saw for chemical recycling technologies when, I mean, they can participate obviously in recycled content if there's harmonization of mass balance rules, but that's yet to be seen in policy for now. But they could also participate in local content requirements since the SUPD also contains that. And we're seeing hopefully investments when it comes to chemical recycled content in crackers here in Europe. So I was wondering if you had any insight on that. From what I understand, there's no policy that actually invests in chemical recycling technologies as of now. It was present in one of the leaks of the IAA and then it was taken out. So I was wondering if you had any insights on where we could see that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yeah, maybe just to summarize it to the extent possible. So there was a question and a comment on the role of chemical recycling and what more can we do to consider see we can scale it up, and when there are positive cases and examples for to go with this solution, if there is a need, or how can we think about the criteria in which we can prioritize different ways in which the green premium can be absorbed. How can we do the certain kind of a mapping across the sector and see where it's the consumers, where is the taxpayer, or any other solution, and also going back to the point that we can also in terms of how do we prioritize the use of feedstock, for example, bio-based materials in case of the content for detergents versus recycled for other types of chemical products or say plastics or packaging, etc. Looking back at the panel, and I'm happy for you if you want to proactively come in and if you have any points or reflections. Maybe Alexis, we can.
Yeah, but I think the question on the chemical. question on the chemical recycling. I think this is more a question for the colleagues of Cefic, I guess. The other one raised on the criteria, I think this is a macro-political or even macroeconomic question. So I think the Critical Chemicals Alliance, if it has a successor, I mean, that can be a place, rather than to discuss specific policy recommendations, specific sectors, maybe that is the right place to discuss this kind of considerations. But I think the question that was raised by Procter & Gamble is the right one. So I think we need to build on that, and I think that's where the Commission comes in. Maybe just one point to add, there is also, and I'm not saying this is the silver bullet at all, but we do still have, recently we met with DG Environment last year actually, and you also have a bio-based alliance. Actually, the lady in charge, the director in charge in DG Environment was really encouraging the different players in the value chain to contribute to that. So she was emphasizing that much more than targets, by the way. So in that sense, I think there is reflection to be done in the Chemicals Alliance, I think, or in the successor of that. I mean, you have one recommendation where you speak about aggregation. I think maybe that can be. And then the alliance, which is definitely a potential, well,
So, in a way, the two alliances should talk to each other even
definitely
more.
That's important.
Yes. So, yeah. Okay, Florie, maybe any remarks on your end?
Yeah, maybe on the first question. So one of the first deliverable we have been busy with in the lead market working group of the Critical Chemicals Alliance is how we want to prioritize lead markets where policy measures need to come first. My, let's say, learnings from this exercise and an analysis that we have also performed with an external consultant is that it very much depends on the societal objective that you are pursuing. So you can look at this from a volumes and impact perspective, which markets represent the biggest share of GDP, where you have the biggest volume of let's say, basic materials embedded in the final product, where you can achieve the biggest greenhouse gas emission reductions or fossil carbon substitution. So that would be one way of looking at it. Another can be more strategic, where you will really consider the resilience of the EU economy and what we regard really as critical value chains that we absolutely need to retain in Europe. Examples of that would be in the pharmaceutical sector or the fertilizer related to the food industry. Another can be identifying markets where Europe wants to lead on innovation. And a final, which I think you were referring to, is in terms of societal impact. One aspect being, where can we achieve most job opportunities? That would be one way of looking at it, or how we manage cost on final consumers. Of course, we considered aspects like price elasticity, but you also don't want to, I mean, maybe it makes more sense to focus measures on sectors that are less, let's say, vital for consumers. So there can be really different ways of approaching this. And I think they are all viable, valuable objectives. And in the end, it's probably about making some form of trade-off. Regarding chemical recycling, maybe not. I would say, I mean, maybe in short, I would say that it is difficult to see how we can achieve huge volumes of fossil carbon substitution if we don't look at chemical recycling as an option. But always with mechanical recycling being prioritized wherever possible, although the limit, I know, I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but the limit or the frontier between both is more and more blur. On the mass balance, yeah, I mean, again, no firm position on this, apart from the fact that energy use should clearly be excluded from the final accounting. And EU content, yeah, I think this has really been a vivid discussion in the implementation of previous regulation. And coming back to the debate on EU content requirements, I think this is really certainly one of the fields to consider. There are other approaches like export ban or landfill ban, but as we know in practice, these things don't happen overnight. So. Yeah.
And maybe just a follow-up question. We saw that there have been, let's say, developments or pilots on product environmental footprints in the previous years. And going back to just the question around sustainable feedstock or the impact, let's say, the carbon footprint on different products, environmental footprint. When we think about developing standards for example, sustainable chemicals in this sense, have you come across any possibilities to build upon this? Because we know that the PEFs are not fully scaled up and they have been limited to an extent. But can we use these methodologies in a way to make some of the decisions about sustainability of the chemicals and their, well, say, yeah, sustainability more broadly, the carbon content, and to help make some decisions? Was there something that? Is there something that we could think about it or connect it when in the context of this discussion on chemical decarbonization?
Maybe my colleagues from the chemical sector can say more to that, but in my understanding, there is no widely adopted methodology for this. So of course, there has been plenty of work and research happening in that field that needs to be considered. Also from taking a product perspective, but I don't think we are yet there. But maybe my colleagues have more to say.
Just checking in case we are missing out on something, and there is something we could connect here. But of course, it's the work on that is also still still work in progress. And Nicola, I don't know if you have any comments.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't open the chapter of sustainability because for the chemical industry, it's a much broader topic than just climate. So it needs to look at many different components. But maybe just 2 comments. I mean, quite often we tend to say, well, the chemical industry is complicated, it's heterogeneous, and therefore we never find any way moving forward because it's so complex that nothing works. But actually, the point that you both were making, like if there are ways of making sense and moving the market forward in certain areas, is where the discussion should focus. Let's not try to solve all the problems of the world at the same moment, but let's see how we can progress, how we can open up markets. I think it makes sense. The only thing I like to and going back also on the issue on mass balance is that discussion on sustainable feedstock tends to be easier to address than on low carbon products. Mass balance is one typical example where discussions are quite tense within our membership, and again, depending on where you are, what is your interest. But fundamentally, it's opening up a discussion, and we have decided to embark in it, and that is we need to go towards some sort of a standardization of the carbon footprint of the chemical industry, one way or the other. Not it's going to be easy journey or whatsoever, but this issue needs to be addressed because it cannot be left anymore up to each company to do whatever they want. And especially it cannot be that in a context of global trade, we cannot have rules that could be then applied differently depending on which jurisdiction you are, and then you define different scope, different methodologies, different ways of bypassing. So we need to, that's the work that we will be doing, where we start doing, and it's going to be a journey, but it's exactly how do we make sure that we have defined rules, and then how do we codify those rules in a way which is can be applied consistently, also outside of Europe, so that we can have a fair comparison when we're discussing products. It's a journey we are starting quite soon. It's not going to be short, it's not going to be easy, but that's exactly trying to address this issue. Like, how do we define, like, if you don't even have a definition within Europe, how can we pretend to apply it outside of Europe? We have companies that are operating across the globe that can help us in that discussion.
When we talk about that, is it, I mean, I guess one can think about the complexities along just that it is technically difficult to come up with these definitions and standards, so it just takes time to come up with the objective solution or to find something that can work for different actors there. But it can also be that there could be also different positions. What is the outcome on what is the business case and what is the economic impact of developing these common standards? And we don't have to go into these details, but maybe more broadly, do you see this more as a technical or also just a question of positioning? And is there something more that the policymakers can do without necessarily adding additional burden on companies or businesses, some kind of an enabling framework on top of what is already happening to develop these clear standards? Because arguably what very often helps businesses is that there is clarity and there is a level playing field, or that there is some kind of a solution or way to account for the situation where there is no level playing field, like in the global sector. And then we can think about policies as also barriers, that has happened, but in terms of anything more that we can think about in terms of enablers to come up with these clear standards and definitions, as balance and others. I don't know if you have any points on this.
Yeah, there are a few issues. One is many of these, let's say, definitions have been developed for commercial reasons, and then we need to move from commercial to regulatory. Well, depending on what you define, it can be good or less good. Then there is the technical complexity, which is primarily linked with the crackers. That is when you have this difficulties in tracing molecules inside the cracker. So it's a matter of identifying what is the right methodology. And again, depending on where you are, you might prefer certain methodologies. But then also, and that's the difficult part, how do you track it and enforce? So who controls the controller? That's the typical thing that you were asking in legal terms. When you start defining something which is then difficult to be tested on the ground. Like today already with colleagues dealing with CBAM, the issue is when you get a product, two products look the same. One is low carbon product, one is high carbon. How do you know which one is it? You rely on a piece of paper that says that it's low carbon, but you tell the whole value chain of controllers that can really guarantee that what you are measuring is exactly what is reported and not something else. To be seen. We are now in the testing phase, so we need to see. These are those issues that we need to address. If you go in other jurisdictions, other countries, how certain I am that I'm comparing apples with apples. Typical example, in Japan, the wastewater treatment is a different permit. It's not part of the industrial side. So if you take that one out, your performance gets better. So these are all these things, like, are we comparing apples with apples? And that's really, so mass balance is one part of a complex story. And that's where, we have our rules. We need to see if we manage to finalize our rules, how acceptable are those rules for other jurisdictions, if you need to come up with compromises. Then if you throw in also a bit of discussion on developing countries and the need to support, that opens up all sorts of grades of gray colors, and that's when things get a bit more complicated. But that doesn't mean that we cannot start working on that.
Yeah, divergent policy frameworks, also some technical issues where you kind of need to, like you said, tracing molecules, for example, and it's so there is one thing about how do you align these different interests, but I guess maybe we can think along the lines, and I'm not asking a question, just making a general comment that we can see to what extent the AI could help us looking ahead, I suppose, maybe to some of the questions around how we prioritize the ways in which absorb the green premium and the developing criterias, developing these grids across different factors. And we worked also a lot on the role of digitalization, and it's very, of course, it's a tricky question because it's a question of sharing information, but all product passports or blockchain, and it's not a silver bullet, but to what extent that can facilitate the audit process and paperless traceability. But definitely that it's not, there are no easy answers to this, also what you said, but maybe we can do more with digital solutions in a feasible way. I don't know if there was any question. I believe there was.
I'm Melinda from A.I.S.E as well. I think I would like to go back to also what Nicola said. It's just the beginning of a journey, and eventually in the Critical Chemicals Alliance we are talking a lot about obligations. And as we heard here today, is also currently we do not have all the methodologies in place actually also to ensure information passed through the value chain. So I just wanted to go back to a point that it has been mentioned a few times, administrative burden. Last Commission, we have had so many legislative initiatives being proposed, and this Commission concluded that we actually have to simplify a lot of these regulations because it was just impossible to implement all of those, and the business was really under a lot of pressure. So how can we make sure this time that we are having the right path with all these discussions that we are having on lead markets? And would it maybe make sense to have a stepwise approach and perhaps prioritize some of the sectors and then take it from there in order for the society also to benefit from this, but also make sure that we are addressing all these discussions around administrative burden that we all have been trying so much to simplify in the past 4 years, 5 years? And this is a question to all panelists, perhaps, who can answer.
Thank you. I don't know, Alexis, maybe if you have any comments. I mean, also what we heard now, but also building on what the panelists.
I cannot disagree because Melinda is my esteemed colleague. So that's, but I just want to make one point, and that's the SME angle. So I think our colleagues from SME United have been pushing for the think small first principle, and I think this is something we very much endorse. We have 900 SMEs in our company, and when I hear the bigger companies, they say if it works for the SMEs, it works also for us, and that is really a fundamental point. And if you don't pass the think first, the think small first principle, then we better stop. So I think coming on top of what we already had, the multiple legislation that we have, the sometimes even conflicting requirements that we have on labels. I mean, at some point we need to go back to what we really need to do in von der Leyen 2, and that's simplification. And I want to say that simplification does not mean deregulation. So we are not asking to deregulate, to stop legislation, but just make sure that it's workable. And what we are doing now in the chemical omnibus is a good example. Obviously, at some point there will be also an omnibus fatigue. We sometimes see that in the parliament. Some of the more center-left groups are putting a stop, and we should also not go too far in this. Keep the regulation where it helps, because it still gives us a competitive advantage. We should not forget that. Once a year, I travel to the US, and there we have a global audience, and people are very interested to hear what is happening in Europe. So in many countries, in other geographies, including South America, just to name one, people speak also Spanish, like in Europe, and so on. And a lot of legislation is actually picked up. So that is really, really fundamental. So we should not throw the water off the bath, or how you say that in English? The
baby with the bath.
The baby with the bathwater. So we have the same expression in Dutch, but it's not exactly the same. That's hence the confusion. But I think that's a good benchmark as well. Competitiveness, the internal market, not just internally in the EU, but also the competitiveness of the single market externally, and how to defend that. Yeah.
And then when we talk about this, and we don't have to talk about regulation necessarily, but policies more generally, besides simplification, simplification process, like are there any policies that you see thus far, indeed, that can be considered from your perspective as an enabler, or any additional policies that are missing but actually would add value rather than being something that would potentially be, let's say, subject from future simplification efforts from your end? Maybe any that we can single out that the public should kind of be mindful when we think about it, looking ahead. To give an example, but there could be others in terms of information, where we know that there are sensitive issues about it, and it's easier said than done to agree on interoperability, on standards, on data governance. But on that or any other topic that we discuss now on the chemicals, I don't know if there are any of these kind of positive examples, listing of future ones to consider.
Well, I will make a very general statement here. So we have, if we would be able to avoid already all the duplication or triplication that we have, then we are already one step further. So as I mentioned on labels, we sometimes face duplications literally on one label. And you look at a multilingual country like Belgium, we have 3 languages in the country. Sometimes we do not manage to put all the information on the label unless we make the packaging bigger. That's not exactly what we want. So avoiding duplication, triplication, I think that is the first step, and consolidate what works well.
But then you would hear the argument, but yeah, that's why we would need digitalization of information as a way to reduce, I mean, not just to reduce the complexities, but actually it's arguably, you can argue it's good for environment to reduce all this number of manuals and instructions in different language, actually, because it's heavy and it takes a lot of the packaging. So it's actually not necessarily good for sustainability, but it's complicated on the business. But then you can argue the digital product passport is also complicated on its own to implement.
Yeah, it's not an easy one. And of course, inclusivity, I mean, not everybody has a smartphone. So that's the first point. But you need to be careful. So, and when it comes to the digital product passport, we are a little bit the guinea pig. Because we have the digital product passport that is being imposed on that, and you have different entry levels. So you have one for authorities. So for example, when you import a product from China, authorities can scan the QR code, and then you have the entry level, which is more for the consumer. So which are different levels. So as such, we are we are in favor of a digital product passport, but we should design it in a smart way. I'm not sure consumers need all the chemical formulas in there, but obviously we should make sure that the consumer is well informed. So if it's well designed, a digital product passport has a lot of advantage. Being it only to, for example, we could imagine a world where you have more pictograms, which are sometimes more better explanation than having all the details. And just to mention one very specific and tiny bit, so in Belgium, if you would say under the pictogram, you would say, please read or scan this QR code, and you have to put this in 3 languages. You can sometimes just say, put an I, information, and then you know that you need to click on the QR code. And there you have information which is not business sensitive. So having, for example, we had the case with the fragrances. So if you put the exact fragrance or the exact formulation, well, then you somehow disclose certain business secrets. So you need to put information which is relevant to protect consumers and which is in a way business friendly as well. So you need to find the right balance there.
And if I remember correctly, for example, in case of energy efficiency and the labels for energy efficiency, now there is a QR code also and a database called April, which is also distinguishing in terms of accessibility between different stakeholders, for example, be it whether this is the other governments or like the inspection, or is it another business entity, or is it the civil society or consumer. So depending on who you are, in a way, the QR code that you have or the data carrier on the electronic device can lead you to different answers on this electronic database, for example.
Just by the way, I said entry level, it's access level, obviously, for the digital product passwords.
Thanks. Florie, maybe I don't know if you have any reflections on this in terms of the simplification. We saw this out. You already mentioned more specifically on deregulation and what are the prospects and limitations in that regard. But when we think about policies as an enablers also, how do we make that distinction? Maybe on anything else you would like to add on top of what you were already mentioning? When we think about also future policies for the way forward, chemical decarbonization, how do we kind of think about in terms of reducing the risk or not going into a necessary future simplification process and kind of avoiding this back and forth process?
Yeah, and this is why I think, simplification, of course, is a good goal in itself, but people put different meanings behind the word. And unfortunately, sometimes it's indeed deregulation that is the intention. But I think there we really need to consider industry in its diversity. There are also many players in industry that were against rolling back some of the measures from the Green Deal agenda just because they have made investments, and by withdrawing this regulation, you're penalizing the early movers and rewarding the laggards. But of course, we should have a debate around simplification. I think one of the shortcomings of maybe the Green Deal is that we tended to underestimate the size of the challenge. We have make it sound like we can combine competitiveness and sustainability without problem, and we had this was well illustrated by, for example, the hydrogen strategy, where we had very ambitious goals, and we were a bit deceiving ourselves and our capacity to meet those objectives. So I think this is what we should learn mostly from the previous regulatory cycle. But let's make sure we don't penalize those companies that have made those investments.
And as a think tank, we do talk with different stakeholders across different sectors of industry, but also different stakeholders more broadly. And indeed, depending who you ask, you would have different interpretation, whether something is a simplification effort or deregulation effort, and depending on, what's your starting point, or what was your strategy, or what you were doing before, that you will hear different impressions and different answers. But what we find interesting as a kind of a common thread, that there is a case to think more along the lines of how do we ensure also that future policy making itself is such that we ensure that we have more consistency, that we have more of the alignment, or we can never have absolute alignment, but that we try to use this as a learning curve in a way. And because, on the one side, some industries would benefit more from this regulation, and they have invested. So there's a question of predictability of the legislation now if we are changing it. From the other side, it was being an issue from the beginning, and there is just a different situation on the green premium than with the costs. And but I think what is kind of what we often find to be interesting is that there are some commonalities, in a sense that one can think more about the policy making itself and further engagement from different stakeholders, and how the process itself is designed and implemented to ensure that we get the most out of policies. And we are not, as you said, you're not China. We cannot have that approach. We cannot replicate it. But there is, what you say, also an interesting case about see how much we can, and Europe is diverse, and our policy landscape, it comes back to some of the fundamental issues that goes beyond this sector we are discussing, and to the treaties and to everything around the European Union, how is it currently functioning, but that we at least try to have some common understanding, and that as many stakeholders on board as possible as one of the ingredients for successful implementation of these policies. And Sometimes it's also about discussion. Different alliances need to talk to each other, different stakeholders. It may sound obvious, but actually it's not always, not always necessarily something's happening. I don't know, Nicola, maybe if you have any comments on this topic, on simplification, enabling frameworks for the way forward.
Yeah, maybe lessons learned from the past, try not to repeat them. Because we've seen all these discussions about simplifications because basically we have done something which went too far and then now we regret and then we try to find a way to go back. Let me take an example from the files that I've been dealing recently and we discussed before, hydrogen. We go from something very big, very ambitious. Then we do a target that requires only a part of it. And then we do 16 pages to define how green is a green electron. And then try to narrow it down to the point that then nothing is happening. And then, okay, it's not working. We need to roll it back. I know, but when you cannot punish the single company that done an investment in the middle of Spain. And therefore, we spent 2 years discussing whether we should review the rules or not. And then in the meantime, nothing is happening. So let's not start now looking at this bio-based product. Let's not start with the only bio-based, which is coming from 3 species coming with certain round which is only happening in these regions. And then we do so narrow that then at the end we cannot do anything. And then we need to realize, oops, we've been going so far, and now we need to wait another 2 years to review the rules because they've been too stringent. Let's try to find something which is helping the business moving forward. And then we can learn along the way. Let's not start with the most extreme possible scenario, and then from there we narrow down so much, then nobody's moving. So that's a bit of the lesson we need to learn from what we've done so far. Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly. I think this is, I agree with what you say, but at the same time, we need to ensure minimum environmental integrity of the measures that we take, because if you allow unsustainable biomass, you are not even doing good to your climate objectives, and this is why having a more pragmatic approach at the beginning can make sense, but this is why I believe having maybe more clear timelines, how we're phasing these objectives, acknowledging that maybe we cannot get it completely right or as perfect as we would like in the first place, but at the same time having a clearly identified long-term vision or where you want to get, and not just aspirational, I think is exactly what would make sure that we can balance this need for a more pragmatic approach in the shorter term, while ensuring that in the longer term we really get where we should be.
Thank you. It's about talking about mass balance, but also it's about policy balance, I would argue. How do we kind of find the right way in terms of prioritizing, knowing that we can never avoid trade-offs. We can just see how do we manage them in the most optimal way. Also comes to the way how we think about policies and how we prioritize. So before we close the discussion for today, I'm just looking at the panelists in case, we heard from you, Florie, now, but also Alexis and Nicola, in case you have any final messages also before we wrap up. Otherwise, I would just say I believe we covered a lot of ground in the 2 hours of this discussion. It's of course a very complex topic. We brought in chemicals and the whole value chain, decarbonisation, competitiveness, a little bit of security, the global dimension, and multiple different instruments looking at the bigger picture, and also some specific discussions about public procurement, contracts for difference, information, standards, and of course, it's not that we expected that we will solve it all and that we will just have a solution, ready-to-use solution. But I think one of the points I would say that it's important to talk. It's important to have a deliberation about this, to ensure indeed that we maximize these benefits, co-benefits between decarbonisation and competitiveness, because arguably these are not two completely separate realms. Trade-offs do exist, or they can exist, depends on how we position, how we design policies. But I think I would say there is more room to be done to address these trade-offs and to reduce them, looking ahead to ensure that we indeed achieve our decarbonisation objectives, and to ensure competitiveness also of the chemical sector, upstream, downstream, and again, given that very fragile global environment that we are facing. So on that, I would just close this discussion. I would like to thank our panelists for today. I think it was very interesting and very insightful. I'm happy also about the interaction, the interactive discussion we had, and also to thank our participants for your active involvement in this event. And of course, we would continue working on this topic. So stay tuned, and we will be happy to have you join our future discussions. Thank you once again. Have a nice rest of the day.